When growing numbers of people who grew up expecting to be elites find that the visions that they had for their lives are just not going to materialize or seem like they're not going to materialize and so on, what they do is they try to indict the social order that they think failed them, and they try to tear down some of the existing elites to make room for people like themselves. And you can definitely see social justice discourse being used in precisely this way.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. My guest is sociologist Musa al-Gharbi. He's here to talk about his new book, We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. This is a fascinating conversation, and it covers a lot of ground. Musa has been making the rounds of some of the heterodox podcasts over the last couple of months, but I think you'll find this conversation is really fresh and covers stuff pretty sure you haven't heard elsewhere. So I am excited to bring it to you. I will also tell you just a little bit of housekeeping as we wrap up the year that the Unspeakeasy, my heterodox women's community, has a lot of events coming up next year. We've got several retreats in places like Texas, Los Angeles, the Catskill Mountains. We're going to do at least one co-ed retreat next fall. So go to theunspeakeasy.com to find out what we are doing there. And now I will bring you my conversation with Musa al-Gharbi. Enjoy. Musa al-Gharbi, welcome to The Unspeakable.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So lots of books about elite overproduction and that sort of thing are floating around, and we've read a lot about them, and I tend to talk about them on this podcast, but they're often written by people who were born into the elite. And you're coming at your book, We Have Never Been Woke, from an outsider's perspective. You are an academic. You did wind up at Columbia University. But before we get into the meat of the book, which I really enjoyed, by the way, I found totally fascinating. Musa, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Oh, sure. I mean, I had a kind of weird journey to being a fancy nerd at Columbia. So before I started, when I started college, I went to a community college in the town I grew up in, Sierra Vista, Arizona. It's a small military town. It's not far from the U.S.-Mexico border. My family was military, going back generations. Both of my parents, my mom, my father, my stepdad, my grandfather fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. A lot of my cousins, a lot of my my siblings, and so on. We're all Army. So I was already kind of the black sheep for having a different vision of a different set of interests and so on. And my initial plan in life was to be a Catholic priest, but then I had this crisis of faith, and then I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And so I was just taking classes at community college off and on for, I don't know, probably a good 5-6 years. And then managing retail stores and doing sales, commission sales and things like that. And then, I had two things that happened in close proximity to each other. I found faith again, and I got married a little while after that. And those two things helped give me a kind of structure and purpose in life again. And so I got after that, I got 4 degrees in 5 years. And I went from community college to the Ivy Leagues and, blah, blah, blah.
So wait, finding faith and getting married does not typically lead one to an academic career. So this seems a little bit counterintuitive.
Well, so the academic thing was just that there are these sets of interests that have kind of haunted me my whole life, that kind of oriented me towards the priesthood initially. And then after I had this crisis of faith, I started studying philosophy just because it was a way of exploring some of these same questions without the God stuff, And at first I was interested in things like metaphysics, which is like the structure and nature of reality and things like this. But then I had a twin brother, and he died in Afghanistan in 2010. And in the aftermath of that, before that, I had thought politics was kind of dumb. It was people getting distracted by the little things, and I was focused on the big things. But then as I was kind of working through this tragedy with my family, I came to realize that politics was kind of more important than I thought, and important in different ways than I thought. And so I shifted. I was already enrolled in a philosophy program at that point, in a couple that I got into. And so I chose to go to the one that was closest to my family. And I shifted my focus away from epistemology to away from metaphysics into applied social epistemology, which is like, what do we know in virtue of what? And I was focused in particular on national security and foreign policy questions with the goal of helping other families avoid the kind of tragedy that my own family was working through. And then gradually, though, my research interests expanded beyond just Middle East national security, foreign policy stuff, but still these questions about knowledge, who produces knowledge, what's the social life of knowledge, what do we actually know about contested social issues, and so on. These same sets of questions still inform most of my work. I just use different methods now than I used to, because I realized that some of the questions I was interested in, I couldn't actually just sit in the armchair and figure them out. They required different kinds of methods, and I was equipped to do as a philosopher.
So much of the book is informed by your experience coming to New York City, coming to Columbia, and being hit in the face with this really kind of shocking, if you're coming from the outside, class system that nobody ever really talks about. I mean, we see hints of it in movies and, TV shows and in books and this sort of thing, but to actually come into it is something else. Before you talk about that, can you say what it was like to be studying philosophy and things like that in a community college, for instance? Who studies these things in that setting? Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that's great about community college in general is that a lot of times when people are studying at community college, they're just taking classes because they're just interested in them. They're just curious. They want to learn more. A lot of the people are intellectually humble. The classes don't necessarily fit into people's 5-year plans. They don't necessarily have 5-year plans. And so this was all in stark contrast. I know I didn't. And this was all in stark contrast with at being at schools like Columbia, where people have the students are very capable. But they're like athletes, and they're like arrows in a way where they have a kind of map, and everything is trying to slot it into that map, and they're very reserved, more reserved, because a lot seems to be at stake if they say the wrong thing or think they're more guarded. Things are all more guarded, and kind of interactions are more. And so there was a lot that and in fact, even humility. So when I was teaching at University of Arizona, if you gave a student a C or something like that, a grade they didn't like, they would come up to you and say, "Hey, professor, I had really been hoping I would do better in the class than I'm doing. What can I do different in order to get my..." You give a Columbia student a C, they're like, "What's wrong with you? Such that you don't recognize my greatness. Let me involve all sorts of third parties in here to dispute my grade and get it raised, whether or not I produced high quality work." And so you see, the Columbia students are again, they're highly capable people who are good at studenting. But what you don't see as much at schools like Columbia that you do see at community colleges is a lot more genuine curiosity, genuine openness, intellectual humility. You see, and it's great in community college. Last thing I'll say is because the classrooms are full of this really broad mix of people. You have people just out of high school who are just starting college and hoping to transfer. You have lifelong learner people who are retired from their real job and are just taking classes because they're interested and bored. You have all sorts of just this. You have military people who are kind of doing this, trying to get credits while serving in the service to kind of, So you just have this really heterogeneous mix of people. And at community college, I had the good fortune of, there's this guy, a professor there, a professor of humanities, Mike Jaworski, who himself had a really interesting life. He was former Harvard Society Fellows, and then he worked for the World Bank for a while. And then his wife had a kind of a crisis. And so they ended up they ended up in this small Arizona town, just trying to take it easier in life than the kind of, And so he was teaching at the community college largely for fun, I guess, because he was interested in me.
Wow, as one does.
And he took a shine to me and really tried to develop me. Like, he was teaching me Latin, and I was taking classes off and on. But even when I wasn't taking classes, he was doing private studies with me about the classics and things like this. He taught me Latin, a lot of other stuff. So if it wasn't for Jaworski, I wouldn't be doing a lot of this stuff right now either. But
so your book is called "We Have Never Been Woke." It is a reference to a 1991 book called "We Have Never Been Modern" by Bruno Latour, sort of a anthropology of science, I guess. I have not read that book. And your central concept, you also borrow from a French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, this concept of symbolic capitalism. Okay, and you talk about this vis-a-vis your arrival in New York City. So why don't you sort of define symbolic capitalism on your terms, and then tell us how you started thinking about it in the context of what you discuss in this book.
Yeah. So one of the contributions of the book, I hope, is it takes French theory and shows how it can be useful for, understanding phenomena in the world in a practical way. Okay. But so symbolic capital. So Bourdieu's notion of symbolic capital, basically what it was are the ways that people who are elites, the kind of resources elites draw on to make unequal states of affairs seem normal and appropriate and natural and so on. And so Bourdieu came up with like three versions of symbolic capital. There's like academic capital, which is when you kind of lean on your credentials or on your association with like knowledge economy institutions to get other people to take your views more seriously than they otherwise would, or to defer to you. So I write for the New York Times. I have a PhD in sociology. I'm a professor at Stony Brook. I don't know why it was hard for me to know where I'm teaching right now. Okay. And then there's also political capital, which is when people defer to you and follow your agenda, subordinate their own desires to yours, because they're convinced that they either have to or that it's in their interest to do so. So, for instance, if you say like, do what I say, I'm the manager. You should do what I say because I'm the manager. That's an example of political capital. Or alternatively, if you've just cultivated a reputation as someone who knows what you're doing and gets things done, such that other people think that just kind of doing whatever you want is best for them too. That's political capital. And then finally, there's cultural capital, which is when people do what you want and defer to you because they think you're cool and interesting and sophisticated, and they want you to like them, or they want to ingratiate themselves with you, and they want they want to make you happy, and so on and so forth. And so Bourdieu argued that collectively these different forms of symbolic capital help mark people as being kind of insiders or outsiders, geniuses or hacks, as people who are worth listening to and taking seriously, or as people that you can safely ignore and or even marginalize. And so I started thinking about so Bourdieu himself also had kind of an unusual journey into the academy, and Bourdieu himself, a lot of his early experiences in the academy were with people looking down on him, like people from more elite backgrounds and stuff, who were kind of looking down at him in these fancy institutions in France and stuff. And this kind of inspired some of Bourdieu's work as well. And so that like there's a kind of weird kinship I felt with Bourdieu in general in terms of our life experiences. And so me going on this, rapid fire journey from community college to the Ivy League, is maybe part of the reason why Bourdieu was also interesting to me. But in general, so I found myself in Manhattan. I had this set of ideas in my mind about kind of who was responsible for the world's problems, and kind of, namely those damn Republicans. Like if only people in the podunk Arizona town that I came from could be more like the enlightened denizens of New York, I thought, well, America would be so much better. And then I moved to New York, and I'm like, ugh.
Okay. So, and what year was this? How old were you? What was your life circumstance? Kind of paint the scene here.
Well, so I was, let's see, this was in 2016. So I was born in 83, 33 years old. 32, because I turned 33 that year.
Okay, so 2016. Well, oh, this is a key year. Okay, so
Yeah.
I assume this is before the election. So this was like the beginning of 2016.
August 2016,
Okay.
like right before
Okay.
the election.
So we thought that the world was about to be something that it turned out not to be. But yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, most people did. Now, I had been arguing
Yeah.
that whole cycle, actually, that people should take Trump's prospects more seriously. Mostly in like screaming into a vacuum, basically. Like not just in my head though. I was publishing essays that whole year, like, "Hey guys, I think you should take this more seriously. I don't think it's going to be a landslide, guys. I'm pretty sure Hillary has some significant vulnerabilities, and Trump can probably win this thing. But whatever."
Where were you publishing these essays? Were you publishing them as an academic, and how were they being received?
Yeah, I mean, I was publishing them as an academic, but I wasn't at Columbia, so people didn't care about what I had to say as much as they did after I became associated with Columbia. And in fact, this is one of the things that was that shocked me the most about moving to Columbia was just how much flows from your association with these elite institutions. So before I was at Columbia, I would pitch things to the New York Times and stuff. I wouldn't even get a rejection. I was below a no thank you. It was, and then I moved to Columbia, and I started having the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on reach out to me cold, not me pitching things to them and them getting back to me, but them saying, "Hey, why don't you write for us? Please write for us. Here's a..."
Because they knew you were you like a PhD student, or what were you doing? Okay,
Yeah,
so did they just knew you were there, or were these, I mean, talk about cultural capital. Like this is a perfect example, like somebody can open the door and make an introduction for you, that kind of thing. But are you saying they just like heard that there was this new exciting, like, PhD student floating around and they were going to call you?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, in some cases, one of the editors knew one of my advisors and I guess he was talking to him about, "Oh, I'm working on something about blah." And he's like, "Oh, well, I know someone who does blah."
Right.
So some of it is that kind. So this is my point, is it's purely network effects and institutional effects. It's not because I became a better writer in the time it took to move from Sierra Vista, Arizona to the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It's purely just in virtue of being associated with this institution. All of a sudden, I'm someone who's worth listening to, when before I wasn't even someone who was worth rejecting.
Right.
And that's a pretty wild transition. One I'm, of course, grateful for, but also that I find deeply disturbing and troubling. Yeah.
Okay, so what were you noticing around you? You move here, I'm assuming you're living near Columbia and Morningside Heights. Were you surprised at like what your neighbors were like, how you saw people raising children? You had small children at the time. What did you see and what shocked you the most?
Yeah, I had a couple kids. I just sent my kids to the zone public school, but that was not the choice that almost anyone else at Columbia made, even people who are PhD students and stuff. Everyone was trying to get their kids into these, dedicating immense effort. Like it's really competitive. It's like trying to get into an elite college, to get into a lot of these K-12 schools. And they're really expensive. They exclude like vast swaths and they're highly unrepresentative of the city in general. But they have these really, really lovely social justice oriented curricula so they exclude you from all the pores and the darks. But then they give you a nice, robust social justice curricula when you're there for the honor of paying $10,000 a year or more to send your kid, to keep them away from the pores and the dark people. But me and my wife, we were both products of the public school. So we just sent our kids to the zone public school. like for like 2 seconds, when I was trying to figure out what are we supposed to do, some of my peers who had students who had kids were like, oh yeah, so the admissions, this, that, and the other thing. And so we were like, oh, is this how it works here? And we were like looking at, and then we were like, what? This is crazy. No, we're just going to send our kids to the local school. And so, yeah, but it was, and actually this is an example of, like there's all this research that shows when you mix more affluent kids and kids from highly educated parents with kids from less educated and less affluent backgrounds, in a world where these people just did send their kids to the zone public school, it would be a game changer actually for a lot of the students who go to that school. At PS 165, it's like 70% Black and Hispanic, overwhelmingly people who are low income. If they had, and it's not just about the extra few dollars they get for each butt in the seat, but also things like the parents taking part in things like PTA and raising money and providing these enrichment activities like they do at their other schools, or the kind of different role models. If what you're seeing in school is a bunch of, if your comparison point for your peers are a bunch of other people who also don't, have strong academic role models and who also don't, and so on and so forth, then it's really easy for other people to fall into that pattern. But if they had more of these affluent, and so there's all this research that shows like building these social networks, having these social ties, conveying this social capital across these, like it would be a game-changing thing to enhance mobility and so on for other people. There's nothing stopping anyone from doing that. In fact, all you have to do is yield to the default. It's cheaper. Nothing could be easier. You just, then it's much easier than jumping through all these hoops and then paying tens of thousands of dollars per year and all of this other stuff. But on the one hand, it's easy, but it's also hard. And the way that it's hard for a lot of people is that even if you can convince them that, because for instance, there's a lot of research that shows sending your kid to if you're the kind of person who would get into, say, an Ivy League school and you go to a state school instead, you tend to actually, for most people, it actually doesn't affect their right. trajectory, their background, their earnings. And the same thing, elite K-12 schools through public K-12 schools, not much of a difference. The people who really benefit from going to these elite schools are people from non-elite backgrounds who get a whole bunch of cultural capital that they wouldn't have had, social networks that they wouldn't have had, things like this. But for more elite people of more elite backgrounds, they already, through a bunch of other means, have a lot of these connections. Mm-hmm. They have this cultural capital and so on and so forth. So they don't actually benefit. I actually want to stop you right there. And I do want to go back and talk about how this sort of hooks up with the woke moment or the quote unquote post woke moment. But, what you just said is really interesting because there's also this sort of line of logic that suggests that if somebody is from a more disadvantaged background and they end up getting channeled into an elite institution, for example, that they wouldn't have been otherwise, either through affirmative action or, DEI efforts, et cetera, that they actually do a lot worse than if they would have just gone to a state school. Like if you've got a pretty promising kid from a disadvantaged background and he ends up at Yale and ends up struggling there, that could be a potentially really negative situation as opposed to if that kid ends up at Penn State. Well, it depends. So if they graduate from Yale, if they're from a less advantaged background and they graduate from Yale, then they're much better off than if they had graduated from Penn State. But a lot of times people who will end up in schools that are that they're not academically prepared to succeed in, or not culturally prepared to succeed in, sometimes they end up flunking out or dropping out and whatever, in a way that if they had gone to the other school, they maybe would have seen their degree through to completion and things like that. So, and in fact, this is the thing that I do some work on, is that in a lot of these elite spaces, especially the progressive spaces, they often create environments that are actually hostile towards the very people they're trying to include in the name of diversity and inclusion. So for instance, if you look in America at who it is that's most likely to hold socially conservative views, to hold religious views, to prize tradition and things like that, it's actually people who are ethnic minorities, who are religious minorities.
You've been listening to a premium episode of the Unspeakable podcast. To hear the rest of the conversation, become a paying subscriber at megandaum.substack.com or theunspeakablepodcast.com. Hope to see you over there. Thanks.